Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 57. Don't forget to like and follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and the madness is here. And how many brackets were busted by Kentucky going out in the first round to St. Peter's, or were you just rattled by the refs with fake flagrant fouls or technical fouls and all that other fun stuff? But either way, again, the madness is here and we're going to break it all down. But first, be a pro and win with DRF Sports Pro, introducing DRF Sports all new premium data feature on drf.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $8.25 a month, you can get industry-leading betting trends, angles, and analytics. With the madness here, it's the best way for you to make some money this March and have fun while doing it. Again, that's DRF Sports Pro. Sign up now at drf.com/sports. And hopefully we will keep up our pro picks here as well on the pod, as we've got you covered wire to wire here for the entire March Madness tournament. We'll recap everything from the first two rounds from a betting angle standpoint, and we begin our quest to seek some value as we head into the Sweet 16 and beyond. But what a wild weekend of basketball. And it was so incredible that I had to bring back my guy, Matt Russell, as he stops by to deep dive with us as well. And luckily for us, that starts right about now. Well, we survived weekend number one of the madness. And here to recap it all is my guy, Matt Russell, who's been working overtime this weekend just as much as the overtime has been working in the tournament. My dude, how you doing? How are you feeling?
Hanging on by a thread from that standpoint. You mentioned surviving. Let's get to the big news right off the hop here. My guy, Sheldon Alexander, 8 for 8 in our survivor pool over the weekend. One of, I think, maybe two people at the most to go 8 for 8 in survivor. Our survivor pool allows you to buy back in after the first 3 days. And of course, listen, we'll talk about them, but there was a ton of upsets, but my guy was bobbing and weaving, man. Forget me, man. How are you doing? How are you feeling? You had to feel pretty good about that weekend.
I will not take any credit for it. All this shows is that the less that I know about what's going on, it's better, because then I'm not talking myself out of things, right? It's like, be confident in what it is that you do know. And then what ends up happening more so is you deep dive more, and then you talk yourself out of, no, don't do this, do that instead. And then you're going back and forth instead of just sticking with the initial thought. And maybe, LeBron and the Raptors can play each other the first weekend of March Madness and just make my life very crazy. So
that's right. We're doing the bigger the distraction, the better, right?
And it's like you're putting together openings for a Raptors game, and it's like LeBron James is questionable until game time. When your whole opening is based on LeBron James playing the Raptors and LeBron is questionable until game time, that adds a level of stress. Right?
That's right.
But the point is, hey, the madness is here. And whether it was Russell Westbrook hitting threes, he still couldn't take away from the madness of March in the NCAA. And, if we go through just a quick overall recap, the West was pretty much chalk, right? You got the 1 through 4 seeds surviving there. The East, there was some chaos. You have an 8 seed, North Carolina, UCLA, number 4, Purdue at 3, and of course, St. Peter's. But even within that, with the East, you got some blue blood schools, right? The Blue Bloods. And you also have crazy upset, and then Purdue, but we'll get there. Midwest, very blah, there's some stuff going on at the bottom there, but Kansas's path is just, seems like it's being paved for them. And the South region has just been amazing. So much to talk about. And I think we need to start with the most recent thing that we've seen, especially because it was just insane. Arizona survives in OT versus TCU in the South region. And we're going to go region by region and just kind of talk about, what surprised us, what didn't surprise us and what's next in each region. But I feel like that Arizona TCU game was just so insane that this is a place to start. And my guy Benedict, right? Like, I was aware of my guy. I was aware of him. But then when the lights shine brightest, and you come up with a big boy performance like that in OT to like just show like, no, I want all the smoke. You know me well enough to know that you become my guy when you do things like that, when the lights are bright and you're putting up the big boy performances. But what did you make of that game? And also just not a surprise Arizona wins, but maybe the surprise was just how crazy that game was. What was your takeaway from that, my dude?
Yeah, I really liked TCU in that game. So I wasn't surprised that game was tighter than one would expect, because one of the takeaways, sort of big picture over the course of this weekend was, and it can be really lame when we get into the conferences, right? Like, oh, which conference is better? And like all of that sort of thing. And like, yeah, okay, we know the Big Ten, it's on the television a lot. They never win the national championship. We shouldn't get all super locked into the Big Ten. Same thing with the SEC, right? And so the Big 12 is the team that has sort of stepped out, and that's not that big of a surprise. Everybody all season long, including you and I, talked about how this was the best conference, right? West Virginia was the last place team in this conference, and like, you wouldn't stun me, I wouldn't be shocked if West Virginia, had they made this tournament under some sort of weird circumstance, that they had made a Sweet 16 run, right? Like, that was a team that was actually capable of doing some damage, not that they were anywhere near actually making a tournament, because they lost to all these teams, right? Like, they lost to the TCUs of the world. They lost to Texas Tech, Kansas, Baylor, et cetera, right? So, I'll be honest with you, I had a little TCU money line in this game. Thought we were looking pretty good up until obviously the very end there. Yeah. So a little bit bummed out from that standpoint, but I don't even really take anything away from Arizona, right? Like, that's the difference between Arizona and the quality of their players. Coaching, we still don't really know that much about, right? Obviously, Tommy Lloyd can recruit and has, gathered the talent that is necessary to make a long run potentially to the national championship. But I look at it and I go, okay, like, these other games, these other teams, like, what's the difference between the Gonzagas and Arizonas versus the, this version of Baylor, obviously Kentucky, right? It's like when the going gets tough, right? The tough get going. And those are the teams that are able to pull a game out of the fire when things aren't necessarily going all that great for you, right? It's like, that's the difference in winning basketball games, right? It isn't like who's going to win by 20 the easiest, even in the first and second rounds. It's when it's not, the shots aren't falling, it's not going all that great. Kirk Reese is just firing threes, hand over fist, right? Like a maniac. Arizona, like, they almost have too many good players. It's like, who's going to play? Tubelis doesn't play that much.
If you're going 1 for 10 from 3, are you a good player though? That's going to be my question. 1 for 10 from 3, you're just firing it up. Like, at some point when you're like 1 for 6, don't you think before you take the 8th shot?
Well, so here's the thing, like, that's what he's on the court for, right? So he is the guy who's going to keep shooting. And so when I talk about, like, we're not really sure about the coaching element, like, maybe the guy who has missed the last 2 weeks because he has a massive ankle sprain, maybe he shouldn't necessarily be on the court when you have the amount of players that Arizona has, the volume of guys and options that you can go to. So again, like, I don't know, right? But again, their best player, Benedict Mathurin, of course, early on, they had, Koloko, who's just absolutely dominating down low, and TCU just doesn't have necessarily the size for that. Eventually, our guy Eddie Lampkin starts getting into the mix, and he's saying the guys are too small. He's 7'1" guys are too small to guard him. And you're just like, what is this? So, I don't take that much away from Arizona. Part of it is like, are we surprised? Are we not surprised? I'm not surprised. That was a tough game, right? And I'm not going to be surprised, as we talked about, if they lose to Houston, speaking of, elsewhere in the South, because, we talked about that last week, right? That Houston is going to be a play that you need to make in a bracket pool to differentiate yourself from everybody else. And so you look at the opening line for that game, it's Arizona -2, right? And maybe that surprises some because it's a 1 versus 5. isn't surprising to us, right? And I think there's some value there potentially on Houston, because you watch them against Illinois. And again, speaking of when the going gets tough, that game gets tied midway through the second half. And then it's like, no, let's just turn the switch here. And Kelvin Sampson's group, right? Again, everybody will talk about how they lost 2 players earlier this season. Maybe, just maybe, that team is good enough that they had 8 or 9 really good players, in the same way, by the way, that Arizona does and that Gonzaga does. And that if they lose 1 or 2 players, now obviously it depends on which 2 players, but if they lose their first and maybe 4th best player, maybe they are just that talented and that deep, right? And so I look at that and I'm like, I can't wait for that game. It's a couple, one of a couple of games that I can't wait for, maybe less so elsewhere in the South, where you have Michigan and Nova. But, again, I'd like TCU in that game. We talked about TCU being one of my biggest, whatever you want to say it, plays in that 8-9 game. That was the game that I was on top of as of, Sunday night on Selection Sunday. That was one of my first plays, and one that actually worked out to a level of confidence that I had, right? Like that, I was pretty confident TCU was going to win, like I said, biggest bet. And then they won that game in the first round relatively easily. So, to vanquish some of these Big 12 teams, and we'll talk about some of the other ones, you really got to put multiple stakes into the heart of some of these Big 12 teams. And that is the best case for a tough conference, schedule and sort of, oh yeah, okay, this team doesn't play that great of a conference. We mentioned Houston, Gonzaga, obviously, and people will go, okay, well, if they don't play that tough of a conference, how tested could they be? Well, I think it kind of works a little bit better on the back end, right? The 8th team in the Big 12 is still going to absolutely be a fist fight on a daily basis. So not surprised Houston won and covered against Illinois. Not surprised they won and covered against UAB. We sort of were able to read the smoke signals on that one, so to speak, with regards to people getting excited about Jelly Walker. Turns out if you have a cool nickname, doesn't necessarily mean you get to cover in the first round. Still a team game. Listen, Michigan, Colorado State, feels like it was a billion years ago. We'll talk towards the end about how sort of crazy betting is in general when it comes to streaks. Got a little story from this past week that I think is interesting for folks. And then your men's, I got to go to you, man. Like, how, speaking of surprised, not surprised, roll it out, Rick.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting tournament for sure, right? So far, and sticking in the South region, you're totally right. We were all over talking about Houston and Houston, Arizona matchup being there, but we also were putting out the warning signals of look out for Tennessee. There's a lot of talk about Tennessee getting screwed in terms of what their seeding was. Should they have been a number 2 seed instead of number 3 seed? And we were talking about the fact that regardless of whatever their seed was, you got to beware for Mr. Roll It Out Rick, Coach Cal, Bruce Pearl, these dudes who are great recruiters, but year after year after year, their teams underperform come tournament time. And I mean, Michigan as an 11 seed, it's very interesting when you just compare the 2 paths and how those 2 teams ended up meeting, because Michigan goes from being on the bubble and most people thinking they shouldn't even be a bubble team, they should just be out, to not being a bubble team and just being in the tournament, right? And then now winning 2 games. And when that game comes up against Ricky Barnes, we can't really say that we're surprised, right? And the reason is you look at the game and you think, yes, they should win. Yes, they have a better team. Yes, they've been playing really well. And then it's just what you said. When the going gets tough, can your coach make adjustments? Can your coach do something to stop the run? And Rick Barnes cannot do that. It's just proven time. It's like clockwork every March.
Yeah. And as much as it's, March Madness is crazy, anything can happen, all of that sort of thing. But you do sit back after this week and this weekend and you go, man, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because again, just looking at that region, Michigan, Villanova, right? Like the least flashy teams, right? They somehow get it done. And when it comes to okay,
and it doesn't matter what their seeds are every year, right?
No, and right? you make an interesting point about the path thing, and I would sort of go one further. Like Michigan was a top 5 preseason ranked team, right? And as much as a bunch of crazy stuff happens and 3-4 months go by and teams have an opportunity to develop or obviously disappoint and almost miss the tournament in some cases, i.e. Michigan, you do still kind of have to have regard for what people think about a team before the season starts, right? Because that's the measure of talent. That's the measure of returning talent. That's the measure of, what the expectation is from a coaching standpoint. Again, the Juwan Howard, okay, like, I don't know how much he's doing necessarily. He even said after the game, he's like, no, I didn't do anything. And honestly, sometimes that sounds like a guy just being kind of, deferential to his kids. No, I think he actually probably didn't really do that much.
Wow, shots fired.
I actually kind of think that
he made sure he found the camera to hug one of the kids on Tennessee when they were crying and lost.
I mean, the reaction.
That's a story for another day.
You know what, though? The reaction to that with people like, hopefully this is shown as much as the last thing. And it's like, the guy punched some guy in the handshake line, man. Like, yes, that's a bigger zero, or that's a bigger negative than hugging a guy is, right? Like, sure. we can't start canceling things out.
All I'll say is that's what college basketball is, right? Romanticizing moments. Sure. And, Coach K, I mean, I'm not trying to compare Coach K and Juwan Howard in the resume and all that, but I'm just saying, like, a lot of things in college basketball romanticize. It's just like a perfect thing that, Juwan Howard's, I'm not saying he thought this through, but it's like, oh, here's my one shining moment, right? Like, that's going to be in the one shining moment montage. Yeah. And that's going to be hopefully the thing that goes forward, when Michigan loses next round to Villanova, right? They can say, oh, our season isn't just about the punch, right? And sure. And that's interesting. But the thing that's interesting to me, right, every March that I forget about is, as you just said, so you see familiar teams, right? Michigan, Villanova, even if we'll get to all these other teams, but like Michigan State, Duke, like Notre Dame, forget about what the seeds are. It's the same teams every single year, but then it's so funny just watching people's reaction to it because, oh, wow, 11 seed made it to Sweet 16. It's like, yeah, but it's Michigan.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. It's top five so before the season, Michigan. Like they now, they have all of their guys. And again, it's matchup by matchup thing, right? Like Colorado State, we saw the Mountain West, we talk about things that surprise, don't surprise, whatever. I don't even know which one this falls under the category of. Am I surprised that the Mountain West like absolutely gagged in the first round on like literally every level you can possibly gag? Like, I shouldn't be, right? Like, we look back and we're like, oh, Wyoming, like, man, they could have beaten Indiana and they just opted not to, right? Like Boise State overwhelmed by Memphis. That's a type of a gag. Colorado State going up 15
In fairness, though, I think Boise State was kind of like, oh no, was that Amani Bates' music? And then he comes out of nowhere. It's like, no. I'm joking. We'll get there. Don't worry.
We will definitely get there. And so, like, you go, okay, I'm not going to be that surprised. Colorado State gets a 15-point lead, and it looks like Michigan's like bowing out. Mm-hmm. And if you put the last half that they played in the Big Ten championship game, right, where they just absolutely gave it up to Indiana and essentially allowed Indiana to get into the tournament, and then the first half against Colorado State, you're like, this Michigan team is horrendous. Mm-hmm. And now, they end up pulling the comeback off against Colorado State. Again, Mountain West loaded full of just absolute nothingness this year. Surprise, not surprise. Both somehow. I don't even really know how that's possible, but it is. Mm-hmm. And then they get, like you said, Rick Barnes, and like he can't find a way to get, Vescovi open for anything. And you take 25 points off of, from what he did in the first round to the second round. And otherwise, the players held up. They were able to get to the rim, right? The point guards that we talked about were able to get to the rim, et cetera, et cetera. And so you end up with Michigan and Nova, and it's like, yeah, of course you do, right? Those two teams are in the final like 3-4 years ago, right? Like, why should we be surprised? I mean, obviously different players, but again, that's the cool part about college basketball, right? It's program. We should know better from all of these teams. But the problem is had Loyola Chicago, for example, been able to make any kind of a shot, right? The stats are like 4 of 15 on layups, right? Under 50% on free throws, and like don't even try to ask them to hit a 3-point shot. Why would we ever think that Loyola Chicago was going to have that bad a game, right? And you can go fill in the blanks with any team that has that bad of a game. They probably played the worst of any one of these teams. And I'm including like the 16 seeds relative to expectation, like 15 seeds, like they were atrocious. atrocious. And if we were sitting here in this sort of alternate universe where Loyola Chicago makes the Sweet 16, we'd be sitting here going like, of course they did, like Loyola Chicago up to their old tricks and all of that sort of thing. But instead they went the exact opposite way. And so it's easy to sort of go, oh, well, of course Michigan and Nova are in the Sweet 16. It's like, yeah, well, there's also a world in which Loyola Chicago was in the Sweet 16, i.e. that world being last year with arguably a more difficult path. And speaking of, before we get out of the South here, it's like, I'm watching that first half with Illinois and I'm like, man, if they had this level of gumption against Loyola Chicago last year, and now, you know what I mean? Because they were hanging with Houston, obviously, right? Tie game to midway through the second half. I was like, speaking of things I'm surprised about, I was surprised Illinois had that much compete with Houston. Now I know the score obviously got out of hand, right? And I was able to sort of take a victory lap on the Houston over Illinois thing, because that was this convergence of two sort of thought processes going the opposite direction, right? The Houston idea of, man, they're the 5th ranked team in KenPom, and like, man, but they haven't played anybody, they haven't beaten anybody, no one quad one win all season long. It's like, okay, but like, you're allowed to look at the team too, right? You're allowed to have an eye test. And by the same token, if you're getting a ton of eye test out of Illinois, like you're seeing Illinois a lot this season, and at any point you thought, yup, this is a team that's going to put it all together and make a big run. I mean, they had to bench Curbelo, who we talked about as being like this guy who's just almost like poison to the team. And, kudos to the coaching staff for being like, okay, we can't play Curbelo anymore. But like, that's the point. The point is that you played him all season long and he is a detriment to you winning the games. And good for you for getting off of that late. And maybe that's what kept them in this game against Houston. But like, man, if they had that kind of effort against Loyola Chicago last year and Kofi Coburn was that good, certainly in the first half, and had he done that last year, we wouldn't have ourselves sort of talking ourselves into Loyola Chicago this year, right? Because like Italy, stay with me here, but like Illinois playing poorly last year inflates the Loyola Chicago, right? And so then we think Loyola Chicago is going to beat like Oregon State comfortably in that next round last year. And of course they don't, but we still have in our mind that Loyola Chicago can do it. And then they play another Big Ten team in Ohio State, and everybody gets caught up in Loyola Chicago, and they're a pick 'em against Ohio State. And again, I don't know that Ohio State's even that good. They had a tough break yesterday when Kyle Young gets, again, maybe reconcussed or however that worked. That was going to be a really cool scene if Ohio State was able to still win that game, because Kyle Young's girlfriend, she's crying up in the thing and she's having a moment, and it would have been, speaking of your one shining moments, right? Unfortunately, Ohio State can't get a ball to fall, and a bunch of layups and threes rattling in and out. Again, it's easy to sort of look back and go like, yeah, of course, this is how it went. It also could go very differently. And I think this isn't even the best round for that. There are other regions that will sort of show us like, man, this stuff can go either way every single time. And you can't beat yourself up about not seeing something, in the future, so to speak. Because again, it's coin flip after coin flip in this tournament.
Totally. And you're right. There are things that make the tournament so predictable. And we mentioned things like Ricky Barnes, and my one takeaway into next year that I will remember as perfectly written by one Kevin Clark, who reminded us on Twitter. He said, Rick Barnes once had Kevin Durant and still lost by double-digit points in the second round to a team whose top scorer was Swaggy P. Nothing else in his career should surprise you ever again. Yeah. Right? And that's it. That's it, man. Like anytime, it doesn't matter who his players are. It just doesn't seem to matter who the players are, right? Again, and I maybe we're giving them a pass here, like too much of one. No, definitely not. But there's no pass.
But also maybe we're not, maybe we're not. So,
yeah. And so from one SEC team, we'll continue to slander the SEC as we move on to the Midwest and Auburn. I mean, right. You're like, yep, that checks. Yeah. Auburn goes down, and, we're sticking with the theme of, most recent games getting us in and out of each region here. So as we go to the Midwest, Auburn keeps the trend going of slandering the SEC. Number 10, Miami just completely dominates them. Auburn goes down as a number 2 seed in the second round, something that you had us on watch. In fact, you had Auburn possibly like had them on watch going down in the first round. If we go back to our pod that we did to preview the tournament, but instead they get their one win, right? They get their one win. Cool. Merry Christmas, Bruce Pearl. But they go down 79-61. And we talked about guard play being an issue for Auburn. And then in that game, 5 for 26 from 3. They just got crushed. Jabari Smith didn't play great at all, but I feel bad for him, right? Like this wasn't close. Like the guards of the U, right? Yeah. It was like Miami. The guards of the U, McGusty was going crazy. Isaiah Wong was going crazy. That dunk Isaiah Wong had, geez, just not a good look. And Bruce Pearl, the parallels between Bruce Pearl and our man's roll it out Rick, like it's just almost too perfect, right? As Jim Larinaga puts on a clinic against them. But if we start there with Auburn and we're talking about surprises, again, surprise maybe to the mainstream fan who doesn't know, who's just clocking in. They're like, oh, a 2 seed goes down. But this isn't really a surprise for you or people who are in tune with what's going on, right? No. And we talked about it, right? The hardest part about this little pocket of the bracket was going to be USC Miami. Right. And to me, I shouldn't say surprise, but the more significant game, I wrote about this last week. I do this sort of fun article about, bracket pools and the 5 games that you need to win, right? We look at the bracket and we go, okay, we got 63, 64, whatever games that we have to win our bracket pool. And the answer to that is no, not really. There's only going to be about 5 games that you have to win. One of those that almost doesn't even count is the championship. We talked about this last week. You have to have the champion. Mine went out on the first night. But for those who still have for those of you who still have your champion in, right, you are still alive to win your bracket pool. Kind of doesn't really matter anything other than that. But you also need 5 other games. And one of them was USC Miami. And I'll tell you right now, I picked the wrong one. I had USC, and I don't feel that bad about it, man, because that game was tied, and we had a Bo Borofsky coming in with it. Speaking of, Bo Borofsky's music, from a wrestling standpoint, he came in the last second there to call a pretty sketchy foul on USC. Miami wins that game by 2 points on the late free throws. And so I'll go to my grave saying that USC was going to win this game if they had made it to this game. And so you have to, again, the tricky part about the bracket pool is you have to flip that coin between Miami and USC to see who gets to take advantage of this Auburn team, of the money line, for example, right? I know, tweeted out that I was on the point spread there. Obviously, we talked about how whoever was going to win that first game was going to beat Auburn. I was on the money line on this game. Was the easiest, plus 200 or so money line that, plus 200 or better money line that you're ever going to get in your life, because you're just sitting there watching it and you're going like, I don't know if Jabari Smith ever plays good or bad, right? Because he's just sort of caught up. It's almost like his head is spinning with all of the ridiculousness that's going on around him with those guards. And you mentioned like the 3-point shooting. Yeah, a lot of that's late, kind of chucking it up. But no, man, like that was the case like early on in that game where it was like, yeah, just fire him up. And, God, there's no one I love more than Bill Raftery when it comes to these games and stuff. But he and the other guys were talking about how like there was a lid on the basket for Auburn. It's like, no, they're actually taking just really bad shots. There's going to be a quote unquote lid on the basket when your shots aren't within any construct of the offense and you're just jacking them up, right? Like, yeah, they're going to miss a lot of the time. But to me, that's coaching, right? Like, yes, they're college kids and I get it. And we talk, I'm a very old man get off my lawn at certain points when we talk about modern day basketball and the Steph Curry if I'm making up a word on the spot of what modern basketball is, and logo 3s are now a normal thing. It's like, could you imagine taking a logo 3 being coached by like Bobby Knight or something like that? Like everything has just changed, right? In basketball, but you're talking about the 3s that these guys are taking. And it's like, at some point, Bruce Pearl, don't you be like, hey guys, let's chill here, right? Like, let's try and take it to the basket, or let's try and like a pick and roll or something. Let's not take a logo 3. How about, But as you know, like it's too late at that point, right? Like it's not like you can just like, hey, we're going to try something different right now. We're going to try not doing that, right? It's a trend. It's like,
it's a trend. It's something they are sort of, again, you're either coaching it or you're allowing it to happen, right? It's something that he's allowed to happen over the course of the entire year. So there isn't a structure that they can rely on, right? And it's why Villanova, as an example, is this team that they have the structure. None of those guys are wilding out of control, right? Whereas you just watch Auburn, it's just like, man, a lot of talented dudes, a lot of guys who could make NBA rosters down the line. Even the point guards who you're watching going like, these guys are a disaster. Like maybe if there's some structure to them, right? If they end up, again, a second round pick or whatever roster invitee in the NBA, it's like maybe a little coaching might help these guys. And that's what you look at and you go, okay, well, no wonder a team that has at least something of a structure in Miami. And I'm not even positive that they have that much more of a structure, right? Like it's the talent level is pretty close. When you look at some of these games, and you talked about like not worrying too much about the seeding, right? We talked about Miami and USC having the high level talent that, USC can win games against the UCLAs of the world, right? We saw that during the season. Miami went to Cameron and beat Duke, right? So it's in them from a talent standpoint to pull this off. And then it's just a matter of like, do they win the tiebreaker when it comes to coaching, structure, and like chill, right? Because we talked about how like a lot of these teams have absolutely no chill. Miami did pretty well in the chill department, right? They took that lead and it was never like a massive lead until the end. So it was like an 8 to 10 point lead. And they just never had that fall apart moment, even though Auburn is, known for relative spurtability, to borrow a phrase from Clark Kellogg. They are known for being able to put up 10 quick points. And they just were never able to do that because Miami had enough of sort of an infrastructure, obviously a lot of transfers and veteran type of guys. You mentioned McGusty, Wong's been around for a while, and obviously the point guard as well, whose name has escaped me because it's super early in the morning and I feel like I went to bed 2 hours ago. And so, you know what I mean? It's like, even just looking at said point guard, and it's killing me that I'm forgetting his name. People are screaming into the podcast right now, but it's just, okay, like I trust him over anybody that Auburn is going to run out there from a point guard standpoint, right? Like, we talk about guards mattering in the postseason in this tournament, right? And you're like, yeah, I rather, Charlie Moore, thank you. Woo. I rather Moore being the guy that I have running a team versus like anybody that Auburn's rolling out at this point. So like, do I think, Jabari Smith played bad or can be blamed for any of this? No, I think he's the one guy who's sort of, doesn't take any of the blame whatsoever. And now Miami, you're talking about like double digit seeds. Now Miami's going to play Iowa State. We just talked about the scrappiness of the Big 12, right? And so like, okay, yeah, Miami from a talent standpoint, way better than a 10 seed. Iowa State from a talent standpoint, right? Again, a lot of transfers, a lot of guys, having to mesh together over the course of a season. But again, they have a plan. Defensively, they have a plan. Offensively, the plan is a little sketchy, to be completely honest, right? You need a guy who is shooting, 20-something% from three to go off to get out of the first round. You need Gabe Kalscheur, who didn't really do all that much in the first round and has sort of, been in and out of being, I don't want to say good, but like being effective over the course of this season. He ends up unable to miss a shot, right? And of course, I talked last week about Isaiah Brockington being a problem. So like, I'm looking at a double-digit matchup here in the Sweet 16, and I'm not surprised by that at all, right? We were on Iowa State to get by LSU. Speaking of lack of structure and coaching chaos, despite the talent. And honestly, I still think Colgate probably should have beat Wisconsin in that first round. I'm watching Wisconsin yesterday, and I was like, where was this version of Wisconsin against Colgate? Now, obviously, that had a lot to do with Iowa State, but
the Wisconsin, I've been telling you that I despise watching year in, year out in the tournament. Super slow, super trash. And what's my guy's name? What's their star player's name? Why am I drawing a blank right now?
Johnny Davis.
Pardon me. Johnny Davis. You're seeing certain spurts where you're like, oh, well, they do have a guy. Yeah. But like the overall structure and suckiness of the foundation that is Wisconsin basketball just like even sucks out the goodness of what Johnny Davis could be, right? Because you see moments, you see flashes, but then it's like, oh, let's slow it back down and let's play a trash ass Wisconsin type basketball. It's like, get these guys out of here.
It's kind of, and that's the balance, right? It's the balance between like having all the structure and none of the structure. and not having this sort of fluid, because like they couldn't get a basket when they needed a basket. And again, I'm going to blame Johnny Davis a little bit too, but also, you know, he was banged up, right? We saw him sort of fighting that ankle injury a little bit, right? And that wasn't the version of Johnny Davis that we saw throughout the regular season. But like, yeah, okay, so if he is sort of hampered, he's 80%, whatever, like what's going on with the rest of the team? So, you know, when you look at surprises, like, no, and I had Miami or USC to make this round. So unfortunately, because I chose USC, again, 2-point loss, free throws at the end, they give up 1 billion points off of turnovers, right? If we're talking outlier performances, and like Loyola to Chicago has the they have the unusual, terrible shooting performance. USC has the unusual outlier turnover performance in that game, right? So one's horrific shooting, one's horrific from a turnover standpoint. Like you can't see that stuff coming. Right. Like that's the type of stuff that's just going to happen over the course of 60 some odd games. There are going to be some outlier performances. And so I'm just looking at it going like, yeah, all right, Miami or USC, I picked the wrong one. And that's going to result in the red through your bracket. Whereas if you had picked Miami, again, a perfectly reasonable first round choice, as we talked about last week, it's like now you've got green through your bracket. And we talked about taking whoever that team is into not just the Sweet 16, but the regional final. And so if you had picked Miami, you're now sitting there going like, man, I got a very reasonable shot of getting Miami to the regional final. And that's going to get you the points. Whereas all these other people who are grabbing the Wisconsins and the Auburns of the world, right? And again, unfortunately, it came down to flipping a coin there on Miami USC. But like that's going to be the difference maker in your bracket, because the top part of this bracket isn't all that surprising, right? The surprising thing, obviously, is that Providence is good after all. But here's the problem. Everybody hops on Twitter and is like, oh, lucky Providence. Now, there's a couple of different things here, right? You and I talk about branding when it comes to team stuff, but we also talk about like branding and terminology. And when Ken Pomeroy has a luck column, everyone's going to gravitate to who's going to be at the top of that luck column. Now, that luck column it's not really luck. It's not like balls are bouncing off of people's faces and going into the basket. It's not like anything like that. It's like, are you winning more games than you probably should? Yeah. Right. And like that might be a skill, right? But we're going to quantify it because we want to be able to predict going forward. Like, why are we surprised? Like Wisconsin was this close to getting not just a 2 seed, but like almost a 1 seed, right? If they win the Big Ten tournament. Now, again, not a particularly good team, so they don't win the Big Ten tournament, but like it was getting kicked around that the fourth 1 seed, the one that Baylor ended up getting, it was like up for grabs. Like who wants it? Maybe Wisconsin, if they win a share of the regular season. They almost won the regular season outright. They win the Big Ten regular season outright and they win the tournament, which they are like maybe 3 wins away from doing. They end up getting a 1 seed. And then we're going to be surprised that they're in a fist fight with a 16 seed potentially, right? Like what if things shake down differently and Wisconsin plays St. Peter's in a 1 versus 16 game, which wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility, right? Especially if Johnny Davis doesn't get hurt. Now, maybe if Johnny Davis doesn't get hurt, it's less of an issue and all of that sort of thing. But the point of the whole luck category is to be predictive about what to expect going forward. And so when Providence beats South Dakota State and a gassed Richmond team, we're supposed to have a parade because like, oh, take that, Ken, and your luck, your metric and whatever. And like, Ken Providence was like, somebody's got to be first in luck.
But right? It's like South Dakota and Richmond.
I know. I know. And so, but it's all like, one, somebody has to be first in luck, right? They can't be all tied for luckiest. That's not how this works. 2, if it was so obvious, and this is a separate conversation, but like society and like mainstream media, and obviously we already know like what the betting, media and all of that's what's going to do, right? About like talking about games as if there was only one way that this game could go. Like, oh, how stupid was Providence -2? Like, what a dumb line. It's like, well, congratulations on your retirement, because clearly you just emptied everything you possibly could and put it into Providence in this one game. And now you can walk away and go live on a beach somewhere. Oh, is that not what you did? Is that not how this works? Because by the way, like one of the second luckiest team in everybody's mind from the top tier teams was Wisconsin, right? And if you had taken all your Providence money and you had put it into Wisconsin, oh, the luck metric is stupid, and like, oh man, narratives, you're 0-2, right? ATS betting on Wisconsin in this tournament, right? As they just barely. Don't cover in what would have just been an absolutely brutal cover if Wisconsin had somehow covered against Colgate. I would have been through the roof on that one. But you know what I mean? It's like, for every Providence, there's a Wisconsin, right? For everything. And like Wisconsin actually had, again, everything's relative here, but like Wisconsin actually had tricky teams, right? Mm-hmm. Colgate was a better team potentially than South Dakota State, or at least maybe a trickier matchup. They certainly played better than South Dakota State did. Iowa State, certainly a more difficult opponent than Richmond, having played 6 games in like 8 days type of a situation, right? Like that, they were just absolutely gassed. So, I mean, looking forward, you got, Kansas. And again, you mentioned, like, we talked about this before the tournament. It's like, man, this road for Kansas is pretty paved. Yeah. And that was even under the sort of soft assumption that we were going to see them play Iowa, that we were going to see them play Auburn, right? The 2 other teams that people thought had a chance. Now it's Providence. Again, maybe Providence pulls this off. Sure. And then it's Iowa State or Miami. And as much as we like Iowa State or Miami, right? Kansas is very familiar with Iowa State. Yeah. Right. And I don't know.
I think early on, as I look at that line, I like Miami over Iowa State, but we'll obviously like get to the previews of like what's going to break down in those matchups more in depth on Wednesday. But like, you're right. You got an 11-10 matchup at the bottom there and a 1-4. Like that couldn't be a better, like, flip-flop of what college basketball is, right? And just like how you're not able to predict what's going on. But the Midwest region has been super exciting so far, just in terms of, you mentioned the bottom of that bracket, and watching Auburn go down was a tough one for sure. And the ACC and Miami doing what they do kind of leads us into a segue of going from the Midwest region to just the West region, and Duke being my ACC segue here. Duke and Michigan State. We talked about that being a matchup before the tournament started, right? We were looking ahead and saying, you know what? Things line up here. Michigan State is somehow able to get by Davidson. They're going to give Duke a go. And they gave Duke a go, right? Yeah. Like that game, at one point, I think I tweeted out, and I'll be honest, I was on Duke and Survivor, and there was definitely some reverse jinx in my brain when I'm saying Duke is done, right? And it's like, it was just not looking good, but we can't be surprised. Izzo always has his boys ready each and every year. Again, regardless of what the seeding is, Michigan State's going to be there. But that game, what did you take away from Duke there? Like, are you putting them in the surprise category? Are you putting them in the not surprise category? Or is it your feature category? Like, just if we start from that Duke Michigan State matchup, what's your takeaway there?
Well, I'd even go further back than that, because I think Davidson was the better team against Michigan State, having watched basically every second of that game. But kudos to Michigan State for getting out of there.
Squeaking it by.
Oh yeah, and some very shoehorn officiating type stuff going on in that game, by the way. Which
hold on. Sorry. Can I just, to back that up? Yesterday was like, wait a second, why is this Duke Michigan game on it? And I went, oh, it's 4:00. Prime time Sunday afternoon. Yeah. So like when you're talking to shoehorn in, like the schedule makers, like their job sitting around for hours and hours a day is, hey, if this matchup happens, we're going to put this in the the New England Patriots, blah, 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 Jim Nantz, Tony Romo spot.
That's right. I'm surprised Tony Romo didn't somehow get on the call for the game.
So yes, the shoehorn was in for sure. Yes.
But like, again, speaking of like, could we be surprised about how this part of the bracket went? No, right? The only thing that was surprising was the horrific Duke cover against Michigan State, right? And
I don't even know how that happened.
Right. I mean, shout out to Davidson. We don't need to belabor the point for getting the late 3-pointer. The Korean guy who I was like, I'm waiting for him to do something, because he's, like there was obviously some like, profiles on him and all of that stuff. And then I'm kind of like, oh man, like, why isn't this guy doing anything? And then he saves the day by hitting the 3. Obviously you had to get in on the number relatively early, +2, +1.5, +1 for a push. Yeah. And Davidson, by the way, ends up closing. They end up closing -1.5, the favorite in that game, which again tells you what at least the market thought of Davidson relative to that. So, no, and I'm like, when you say like, which one is it? Surprise, not surprise, like, and going forward, it's like all of the above, because we already know Texas Tech and Duke were going to play in this game. Like we've had this thing.
We were setting it up.
Yeah, I was pre-mad about this last week. I'm still pre-mad. I'm going to be mad while we watch this game. And Duke pulls a Purdue and gets 50 free throw attempts in this game somehow. Like that's just a thing that's going to happen. You can see the market right now has Texas Tech -1, -1.5. That's surprising to me, not because it's not the correct number, but because it is the correct number. Because, you know, obviously Duke is going to somehow win this game, and it's going to be absolutely infuriating. Now, I say all that to say, probably going to be on Texas Tech because I just can't help myself, because that is the quote unquote right thing to do, because Duke should have lost this game to Michigan State, or very easily could have lost this game to Michigan State, and obviously had no business covering whatsoever. And then obviously a shout out to Notre Dame. Again, speaking of things that were incredibly predictable, anybody beating Alabama. And I don't want to sort of brush Notre Dame off, because shout out to them. We haven't spoken since Wednesday. That was my big play for the first 4 games on Wednesday. And of course, that thing had to go until the middle of the night. You know, St. Patrick's Day. And again, they able to pull it together, travel, all of that sort of thing, and still beat Alabama. Again, that's how Alabama was this year, right? Not remotely surprising. If you're a team that loves to shoot 3-pointers, you better be good at it. Alabama, not. That wasn't even the thing that crushed them. It was poor defense. If you build your team around defense and 3-pointers, Nate Oates, you should probably play better defense, and you should probably be better at shooting 3-pointers. So an easy one there. Obviously, Notre Dame gives a ton of fight there to the Red Raiders last night. And I thought this was going to be a Mike Bray special, where he's going to find himself in the Sweet 16 here again, as a, you know, double-digit type of a seed. And then we were going to get a Notre Dame versus Duke type situation. You go, man, from a branding standpoint, that's still pretty good, right? You're starting to, maybe Texas Tech isn't going to get shoehorned in, right? It's not like we thought Texas Tech was going to get shoehorned in. It was more like Texas Tech is good enough to get there, and they're going to get sort of unshoehorned because Duke is going to get every call come Thursday night, and then they're going to go up against Gonzaga. And of course, we'll talk about that. So, I mean, you know, Duke is Duke, right? Like, it's, you watch that game and it's like, well, neither one of these teams. We talked to Michigan about Michigan State being a team that isn't in love with defense this year, and Duke certainly isn't in love with defense. So one of those two teams had to outscore the other, and it just happened to be Duke getting the late 3-pointer to sort of seal that game away. It wasn't going to be a defensive play, let's put it that way, that sealed the game for either of those teams.
Yeah, definitely not. And I think there's some things going forward that we'll deep dive into when we look ahead to that Texas Tech Duke matchup. But, you know, the one thing, obviously everyone talks about Banchero, but I think Griffin and Williams showed that they are also real. But I think it also like covers up the overall lack of depth that Duke has beyond, let's say, those 3-4 guys, their top guys. You know what I mean? There's not much after that. And when Griffin went down, things got very sketchy there for a bit. Right. And there's some, I mean, speaking of sketchy calls, but we'll get to that Texas Tech Duke matchup and why we like Texas Tech. We'll get there. But at the top part of this West region, which again, all chalk, the 1 through 4 seed surviving, but it almost wasn't the case, right? Like Gonzaga almost didn't do their part here. And what a matchup. Of course, you talked about Memphis and what could happen. And a lot of people, you know, I mean, first off, the Amani Bates coming out of nowhere thing, I don't like, I didn't even know that was a thing that was possible, that could have happened. And then all of a sudden Twitter was just going crazy because he's warming up.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, is this legal? It's like, wait, what's happening here? Like something just seems super shady about this. I don't know what the rule is. It's being broken, but I feel like some rules being broken. You know what I mean? But we end up in this point where we were talking about, does Memphis have a chance to knock off Gonzaga? And then now you're adding in one of the preseason potential top players in college basketball to this. And you're like, hold up. Yeah. And so the game goes on and Memphis is up 10 at the half. Yeah. And at that point, whoa, like there's so many things that could happen at that point. And I gotta be honest with you. You tell me my biases, you tell me, you know, when I'm wrong, you keep me on track. Yeah. I'm here to admit my man's Drew Timme.
Yeah, man.
he did his thing. He did his thing, whether it's giving speeches at halftime or just coming out and just balling in the second half. Yeah. He's really the reason why Gonzaga's not out of this tournament.
Yeah. Well, I would see that, and I would raise you and Andrew Nembhard. And that's a guy who I have like sort of focused in on. Well, I have the backcourt in general for Gonzaga sort of locked in as a thing that might be vulnerable to the right team. And so this to me, it's not less about Gonzaga, because in theory, we're supposed to know that Gonzaga is good, right? We're supposed to know that they're capable of that. If anybody thought that 10-point lead for Memphis was safe, that it wasn't really like a 4-point lead, then, you know what I mean? You haven't been paying attention to A, Memphis, or B, Gonzaga over the last few years.
And also Penny Hardaway as an actual like coach, because there's some sketchiness going on there with, you know.
Well, so here's the other element, right? Like you mentioned the Amani Bates thing, but like you watch him play and he's absolutely lost out there, right? He has no idea where to go on offense. He has no idea what to do on defense, right? And it's like, that's going to happen when, of course, right? Like it doesn't matter how much talent you have. And you could tell offensively, they were trying to make him sort of the spot up 3-point shooter because he can obviously shoot. And they're like, no, man, just in the corner. And maybe if he had played throughout this entire season, it would have, you know, things would have gotten sort of figured out, so to speak, and he'd be more of a dominant force with regards to like penetrating into the defense and all of that sort of thing. And then maybe he'd be able to sort of play any sort of functional level of defense, but he's absolutely lost, unable to get a, you know, box out, rebound, any sort of defensive coverage thing. He was just completely lost on. And so when they say like minutes restriction, it's like, was that a health? They were talking about on the broadcast. They're like, is it a health thing? Like, are the doctors putting on a minutes restriction? Is this a coaching minutes restriction? Is this all just a made up minutes restriction because they know that he's going to get exposed defensively and he doesn't know anything with regards to the offense and the sets and stuff that they would theoretically be running? You know, by the way, like they get into foul trouble really early and it turns into this shell game with Duran and all of these other guys. And it's like, who's coming in? Like how many minutes can you get this guy get? And you can't play Gonzaga from that position. No. And so I think overall, this is actually a little bit more about Memphis. And from a betting standpoint, it's a perfect example. It's not perfect because they didn't actually win the game, but it's something of an example of the idea of high end, right? Like what's Memphis capable of? And so if you were going to bet Memphis, whether it was against Boise State, they obviously won and covered. Whether it was against Gonzaga, they ended up covering, but like, again, they played the game of their lives in order to cover that game. We saw what Gonzaga was capable of in that first game against Georgia State. Not that I'm comparing Georgia State to Memphis, but you sit there and even a tie game with 10 minutes to go, you're not comfortable that you're covering plus 10 against Gonzaga. You just aren't. To me, it's more about, all right, if we're going to invest in Memphis, let's invest in, you know, we're going to go in small, but we're going to go in 50-1 that they win the region.
Yeah.
Right. And like, you can't tell me if they were up against Texas Tech or if they were up against Duke, that they don't come out of that game winning, right? Yeah. And to me, that's the difference between Duke and Texas Tech and Gonzaga, is that Gonzaga they can do it both ways, right? They play good defense and they have that ability to, if Chet gets in foul trouble, right? Yeah. If they only have sort of Nembhard and Timmy, that's good enough against a team from a talent standpoint is like top 5 in the country. And there's a reason like they rate incoming recruiting classes to give us an idea of who has really good talent. Again, we talked about Michigan being a top 5 team before the season started. Memphis was top 10. Yeah. That's the point. The point is the disappointment of Memphis throughout the season that led them to, you know, Bates leaving for a while. And again, who knows where he went, but apparently he was able to come back. But the point is like, yeah, this is a talented team from before the season started. And yeah, because 20 to 30 games happen and things didn't go according to plan, doesn't mean you should sort of, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, right? It doesn't mean that Michigan's not capable as an 11. It doesn't mean that Memphis as a 9 seed isn't capable of toppling a big time team. Now, again, when it comes down to crunch time, maybe that was just always going to be the ceiling. It was always going to be, you know, lose by a couple of points type of thing for Memphis. Maybe that's the case, but at 50-1 to win the region, if they get by Gonzaga, right? If the couple of shots don't go for Gonzaga and the couple of them do for Memphis, and you're sitting there with Memphis versus Arkansas in the next game, with the way that Arkansas looked in those 2 games against not particularly tough opponents in Vermont and New Mexico State, and then either Texas Tech or Duke, with the holes that both those teams have, Texas Tech on the offensive side, Duke on the defensive side. 50-1 isn't the craziest thing, right? And so throw $5 on Memphis to see where that goes, right? And it was obviously really, really interesting for a long time, but you don't want to necessarily rely on Memphis to just be sort of a little bit better than average. You want to buy a team like Memphis to like hit their stride and have that sort of run if they are physically, from a talent standpoint, capable. And so, yeah, that bet doesn't end up working, but I think that's the way it's instructive that that's how you should play these types of teams going forward in any sport.
No, for sure. And like, that's kind of why, you know, sports is so great, because there's so many different angles and ways that it comes out that aren't necessarily able to be quantified through a number. Right. And like, you end up in this game where Memphis, as you said, super talented squad, they're right there, but the intangibles of like Timmy, knowing that he has to step up and he has to make plays, and him being there and making a run, in comparison to Memphis trying to get Amani Bates back in randomly and shoehorn him in right in the middle of this tournament run. And then add in, you know, a vet coach in Gonzaga's coach, Mark Few, against Penny, who isn't nearly as seasoned. Like, all of those things that you're not able to, like, you know, have a number to say, hey, this is an advantage, is why sports is so great and what makes the gambling aspect of it fun. And the reminder that, hey, even when you're making these picks, what is it? 57% you're really good. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, that's a reminder, and that's what makes March Madness so great. And that part of the bracket, I mean, again, we will look ahead. We will look ahead later on this week at these matchups, Gonzaga and Arkansas, and of course, Texas Tech and Duke. But there's one more region that we need to talk about here. And the one more region is very interesting. And I know I said that we were starting with the latest thing that we just saw in this region, but I feel like I'd be doing this pod a disservice if I didn't start with Coach Cal and Kentucky losing to a team called St. Peter's. And I have a funny story for you, which sums up March Madness to me. On Saturday night, I went to my friend's dad's 70th birthday, right? Rushing from work to get there. I see a bunch of my friends who are all there. And that was like the guy whose house we like grew up in when we were kids, and we go and play video games. Right. So like, we're all cool with the fam. And one of my friends is bragging. He's like, oh yeah, my March Madness pool, like 15 of my friends, I'm in first place. I'm like, oh man, I haven't watched nearly as much as I should have. And he looks at his phone and he starts going through the bracket. He's like, yeah, I'm in first place. And he goes, wait, Kentucky lost? He's like, who's St. Peter's? He's like, damn it, I guess I won't be in first place for long. And we're all like just dying. But to me, that's just perfect about like what March is and filling out your brackets. But yeah, who is St. Peter's? And Kentucky lost? How did this happen? What's going on? It's one thing for us to be like, hey, Coach Cal, roll out the ball, and you know, they're going to disappoint. But this is an epic level of disappointment.
Yeah, and it's funny, right? So one, St. Peter's then goes and beats Murray State, and so you feel a little bit less stupid for being the guy who thinks that Kentucky's going to win the national championship this year. Even though, no, I still feel pretty dumb about that.
Hey, I was with you with Kentucky as well. It's okay.
Well, I mean, look at it this way, right? Like, okay, you pick, you know, I said, well, let's take a flyer on Auburn to lose to Jacksonville State, right? And it's like, it's a 215. So whether we're like, okay, yeah, we didn't get that correct, the Auburn Jacksonville State, but it's like 15 still won. And it was arguably the like most surprising one. Like, I think I would be less surprised if Delaware had beaten Villanova. I think I'd be less surprised if somehow Duke lost to Cal State Fullerton because of the idea that St. Peter's, like, how are they going to be able to score against Kentucky? But one of my favorite, and it's, you know, not a secret necessarily, but like, you know, if you follow Shot Quality on Twitter, right? And the Shot Quality website, it's a thing that's sort of kind of come up in the last year or two, right? Where it's the evaluation of one's shots. How, you know, you and I talk about, hey, if you get really good shots, you might not be as talented as the other team, but if you're creating good shots, you're probably going to hit a lot of those shots, and that's going to allow you to win a game. And so a lot of these upsets are sort of built on the idea that, wow, this less talented team created a lot of really good shots and were able to make open shots. And they were just good enough defensively to marginalize the other team's talent because they weren't able to get a ton of good shots. That wasn't the case in this game. The shot quality sort of after, they give you a score of what the game should have been based on the shot quality for each team. And so, this game went to overtime. Obviously Kentucky had an extra 5 minutes that they could have shown that they were the better team. But the shot quality score for this game was Kentucky by 22.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, this wasn't a situation where it was like, man, St. Peter's really moved the ball around and Kentucky couldn't handle it, like a UMBC Virginia type of thing, where it was like, man, UMBC's getting all of the wide open shots, right? And Virginia's not. And like, that wasn't the case here. And you go, even just like looking overtime, all the free throws missed by Kentucky. Like, this was a full scale giveaway in this game. It was just an absolute giveaway. And then, so St. Peter's gets life and they get to play Murray State. And that was a far more sort of, I don't want to say legitimate win, but like even post-game predictable, if you will, right? Like that game, the Murray State game made way more sense than the Kentucky game. So again, two different things. I'm like, I can't really beat myself up because St. Peter's ended up beating a very good Murray State. San Francisco and Murray State, arguably one of the best games of the tournament so far, certainly of the first round, as far as quality of play. You're watching that game and you're going, well, both of these teams should move on to the next round. Like, can we sub them in against, instead of some other team? But then Murray State probably played their best, not possible, but like one of their best games against San Francisco. And how does it work with college kids? You're probably not going to play that well the second time, or you're probably not going to play as badly the first time. Mm-hmm. So St. Peter's ends up actually playing better in the second game, right? They win against Kentucky without playing particularly well, and then they play well, and so they win the game against Murray State, who is not playing as well because it took them everything, their top game, if you will, to beat San Francisco. And so now we're sitting here with St. Peter's in the Sweet 16, something that obviously nobody predicted, so has to be filed under, completely unpredictable.
Yeah.
I don't want to say I'm surprised that Purdue made the Sweet 16, but like, I also am, right? Yeah, obviously they're going to get a walkover against Yale. I certainly, we talked about how I like Texas in that first game against Virginia Tech. That was very sort of validating because that came at a point where I could have really used a win. Again, we'll talk about that here to close. But Purdue ends up getting 45 some odd free throws yesterday. I have a stat here. Hopefully I can pull it up quickly, but if I can't, you'll get the general gist of this. Here it is. No team has taken as many free throws as Purdue did. 46 was the number of that.
46 free throws is insane.
While its opponent took as few as Texas did, they had 12 free throws. Okay. And that hasn't happened in a Division I game in more than 4 years. That is the biggest ratio, so to speak, in 4 years. I'm not talking tournament.
Yeah.
Division I basketball. So like the previous one was a Nebraska UTSA game from December of 2017. That's the discrepancy. Now, again, different teams, right? You're getting Zach Edey. Zach Edey's getting every call. Like, he's 7'4", man. We don't need to call foul on every single play. Like, I know there's a thing where a foul is a foul, but like sometimes a foul just isn't a foul. Sometimes it's just contact. Sometimes it's just a physical play. Obviously, Travion Williams getting post-ups left, right, and center as well. Different style, right? I tweeted sarcastically, and you'll like this. Tweeted sarcastically that their Texas offense was, hey, let's try another long two from Marcus Carr, as if that wasn't the dumbest thing. There was I got one like on that tweet. You know who it was from? It was from one of Texas's other guards' family members. Amazing. Liked that tweet.
Amazing.
So Courtney Ramey is a guard for Texas. He was obviously out there. He's getting shots up too. Mm-hmm. But one of his family members looked like a brother. Maybe it was his dad. Hard to say. Mm-hmm. Who runs basketball camps in, I believe, Texas. He immediately after it's and I was like, oh, Malcolm Rainey or whatever his name was. I'm like, oh my God.
That's hilarious. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's okay, well, I guess they deserve to get those free throws because Texas is not getting the ball inside. Their leading scorer fouls out with just 2 points in the game. And by the way, that game's a pretty close game at the end too, right? It's a 3-point game. And I just tweet out this is how dumb sports betting is, right? Purdue gets 45 free throws. If you had told me beforehand that Purdue was going to get 46 free throws, would have bet Purdue, but they didn't. And that game was still inside the number with a minute to go. And you're sitting there going I'm wrong. They get 46 free throws. I've got +3.5, and it's a 3-point game late. and I'm wrong about this, like I'm going, and you're sitting there going like, well, they're going to end up covering this game. You're like, I'm going to be wrong about this. That doesn't feel right. So, I don't know if that's a surprise that we got beat on that one, but that one certainly didn't feel all that great watching it, as there was a parade to the free throw line.
It happens, right? And that's like the lower end of that East region. As we go to the top part of the East region, North Carolina, we were on watch at the first part when we did the preview, talking about how Baylor was the weakest. I mean, it's obvious. We know Baker Mayfield also.
You're dying to talk some Baker Mayfield this week.
Right. But Baylor, we thought Baylor could go down early as one of the first number 1 seeds to go down, and they are. Yeah. And just North Carolina, it was just primed. The way that matchup was set, it was just primed. You could see that win coming. And even though it was a little hectic and crazy at one point, we still end up with the matchup that we thought we could see in terms of 2, as we call them, blue blood programs, UNC and UCLA meeting up in the Sweet 16. So I can't really say that we're surprised there.
Nope.
But when you talk about how we got there, how did that break down for you point spread wise as we kind of wrap up this East region here?
Yeah. So isn't it infuriating? Like, the infuriating part in all of this, right, is you can be right about, UNC making it into the Sweet 16, right? And I talked about the piece I wrote about your bracket pools, right? And picking the first round game that you needed to pick correctly was USC Miami, because that's the team. Whoever wins that game, you should be riding them through. Like, I'm not going to print a bracket out for you and like tell you to make all these picks, because, by the way, that wouldn't have gone great the second that Kentucky went out, right? So the infuriating part is you go, okay, like, I'm pretty right about USC Miami being that team. And again, we'll see how right. If it's one of those teams going to get to the regional final. My round 2 game that you need to get correct is UCLA St. Mary's. And again, like that first round matchup, that's because whoever wins that game, in my mind, is going to make the regional final. I still feel that way. You're watching that North Carolina team. And again, we talked about North Carolina being the team that could beat Baylor, and they're up 25 points and everything is going great and all of that sort of thing. And you go, yeah, nailed it. We talked about how the issue against Marquette is that it's North Carolina, man, and like they can screw something up super easy. Now, they won that game in the first 3 minutes. That game was basically not even competed in the first round. So they get through comfortably. They look like they're getting through comfortably. And so you end up on the fence here now, as I look forward with this team, where I go, is this the team that's capable of getting up 25 to Baylor when Brady Manick is on the floor and, half the team hasn't fouled out and they aren't having absolutely no chill, all of that sort of stuff, right? And would that game had gone as insane as it went in the final 10 minutes of that game, where, yes, the officials were calling everything for Baylor, but every time North Carolina did anything, it was a choice between the dumbest thing you can possibly do and anything other than the dumbest thing that you can possibly do. And North Carolina continued to choose the dumbest thing that you could possibly do, right? A constant, like, Leaky Black might as well just change his name to Dribble into the Corner, right? Yeah. It would, because like that's what he was doing. He was dying to get trapped the entire game. And again, maybe it's because Brady Manick's not out, again, they end up losing another guard, with a few minutes left, all of that sort of thing. But it was just so predictable. I was watching the live line. It was like plus 700. I was like, and I was on I should mention, I was North Carolina money line, as we talked about before the tournament started. If this matchup happened, North Carolina would have to be the play here. And I'm just like, God, I think Baylor plus 700 is a pretty good bet right now. And it's like down to 400. And you're like, man, that's a really good bet right now. And then of course it goes to overtime, and you're like, yeah, what an idiot. Of course I should have made that bet. Like, I'm watching this. And so now you're going to see them go up against a UCLA team that is going to just sort of systematically do the correct things. To you and I always talk about, like, football or basketball, the stuff that's happening in the dark places, right? In the corners of the sport. Like, how are you able to get that extra edge? You're cleaning everything, right? You aren't just cleaning the middle of the room. You're not sweeping stuff under the rug like a Tennessee, like a Memphis potentially, right? You are going into the corners. UCLA and Mick Cronin is a guy who's going into the corners. He's making sure that all the dust is out of the corners. Everything is going to be tightened up so that they can win the close game. So I look at this next game and I'm like, man, UCLA and UNC, like these are just two different teams when it comes to what's going to happen in the last 5 minutes. And so I don't see North Carolina getting out to this massive lead against UCLA. So again, the infuriating part is like, yeah, you can be right. You could have had UCLA. You can have, if you could have, had Miami, and you could have North Carolina, and you're all green.
Yeah.
In your bracket. And then you look down and you just see that Kentucky's out and you just have this massive gash that goes all the way to the championship, and it doesn't seem to matter. So that should be, and you know what? The last thing on the East is the St. Peter's story is very cool. And we get it once a year, right? Whether we're sort of forcing it sometimes with Loyola Chicago, and it's like, they're actually a pretty good team. Like we have to stop calling them a Cinderella, or a weird, Power 5 team like Oregon State last year. Or we get the occasional 15 seed that goes on a run. Again, the problem is everybody loves a good upset until you look over on Friday night and the first game of the day is Purdue and St. Peter's.
St. Peter's, exactly.
And you go, okay. I mean, I guess I'll be interested in that game, but like, how do you think that's going to go with Zach Edey and Travion Williams and Jaden Ivey, by the way, who we have to at least mention since he just absolutely assassinated Texas last night with a 3-pointer, which is not necessarily Jaden Ivey's game, or at least the most famous part of his game. Yeah. How is St. Peter's going to deal with that? That seems almost impossible. And instead of Kentucky, Purdue, which I think would be a really interesting game with Oscar Tshiebwe, who, by the way, player of the year here.
Great game.
30-19 against St. Peter's. So it wasn't like they even took out their best player. Yeah. He was still able to do everything that he needed to do, but I digress.
Pretty much the only guy to show up for Kentucky, and clearly Coach Cal didn't show up for Kentucky doing his normal Coach Cal thing. But hey, story for another day, and another reminder for next year's tournament when we're filling out our brackets yet again. But at the end of the day, we are into the Sweet 16, and we will look forward to that on Wednesday and preview that, and we will be back with a full-on breakdown. But until then, my dude, where can the people find you to find out some more information as you deep dive and start to preview what we're looking for going forward?
Yeah, at MRussAuthentic on Twitter is where you can find me. I do want to sort of do a quick story from this past week because I think it's instructive on betting and variance and this idea that, like, whatever, everything always has to be a win. You and I talk occasionally about how nobody ever loses on Twitter or anything like that, right? I've had a losing tournament so far. Shouldn't be that surprising. We talked about some of these things that have happened that were, outlier type performances. I've somehow, within the structure of this tournament, within 4 days of this tournament, I had the coldest streak I've ever had and the hottest streak I have ever had. And it was within 4 days. And it's sort of easy. Yesterday I put all my picks out on Twitter, and I ended up going 3-2 against the spread. And then we had a money line parlay that didn't work out. And so we ended up sort of splitting on the day. And that's, in theory, kind of what you expect, right? You sort of expect the 3-3 days. Hopefully there's more 4-2 days, something along those lines, right? I started this tournament. So we go 2-1 in the first 4 games. That was great. I then get into the tournament, and in the first 22 games, I bet 16 of them. I went 1-15 against the spread in that first round. 1-15. I have never in my life had a subsection of 1-15. Now we talk about how, like, man, we're going to make 1,000 bets. We're going to make 1,000 bets this year. We're going to make thousands of bets in our lifetime, and a sort of subsection on bets, 701 through 716. Like, maybe you're going to go 1-15, and hopefully there's a 15-1 out there. Well, I go 1-15, and you go, okay, well, what happened? Well, we lost every overtime game, right? On pick'ems, right? So we talked about San Francisco, Murray State, right? San Francisco, they lose in overtime. Okay, fine, whatever. San Diego State up 8 points. They had a 14-point lead in that game. Creighton, their largest lead was 2. Guess who won? Creighton won, right? Creighton won in overtime by 2. And so you go, okay, man, like I probably deserved something along the lines of 5-10, maybe even a 6-9. And you go, and that would have sucked. Right. But 1-15, I'm sitting there on Friday afternoon, and it's a bunch of teams, covering big spreads, and there was no interest whatsoever. And Loyola Chicago can't make a shot to save their life. Obviously was on them at Pick'em, and that was obviously the wrong side. And I can't win a game to save my life. And I just go, I don't know if I'll ever win another bet. But one, my responsible betting is allowing me that I'm not over, indulged, if you will, just because it's the tournament, right? I'm not over betting these games. I'm betting them at a normal rate, and this is just part of variance. And then Notre Dame beats Alabama and Texas beats Virginia Tech. A couple of games that I was sort of, pounding the table on, so to speak, with regards to that. And that starts a run of 11 straight wins over the course of Friday night and Saturday afternoon. And like some of them were dicey. Duke over Cal State Fullerton, for example, right? We get a late layup from Cal State Fullerton to cover sort of semi-backdoor game that could go either way, right? You're starting to get a little bit luckier. A couple of overtime games go our way. North Carolina, I mean, that was clearly the right side, especially from a point spread standpoint, but how they ended up pulling themselves up off the ground and winning that game, I will never know, but they did. And you're sitting there going, I can never lose another bet. I am 10, 11 straight. I can never lose another bet. And that was 24 hours from being in a place where I'm like, I don't know how I'm ever going to win another bet. And so normally you'd be going 3-2, you're going 2-3, you end up, at that point, you're 13, 16-1 over the start, from the first four on. And you go, okay, that's not great either. Got a little, obviously in that 1-15 stretch, got really unlucky on a handful of plays. And maybe a couple of those go a different way and you're 16, 13-1. And we're just sort of like, yeah, it was a decent weekend. And then of course we end up going 3-3 on Sunday, right? So we're a little bit down on the tournament, but at one point, 1-15, and at another point, 11-0. So the lesson here is about variance and about that we're just going to keep making bets. But if you're doing so in a responsible way, i.e. only using a small portion of your bankroll per bet, I would, usually recommend 1% of your bankroll, right? You can come out of these negative streaks. And if you are doing something correctly, I wasn't doing anything different when I went 11-0 than when I went 1-15, right? It was literally just a variance situation. Those games could have been intertwined, win-loss, 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 and we would have ended up in the same sort of record area. It just so happened the weirdest 2 days of my betting life, going 1-15 and then 11-0 back to back. You know what I mean? Who knows, right? Who knows? And so worth mentioning, because I think it's instructive to people that when they go sort of cold, sometimes it really is you just went cold, especially at the end of the season. If this happens on a Saturday in February or January, is it a big deal? No, it's just kind of a bummer. It's the tournament. And the idea is like, it's supposed to be fun and we're trying to win every game and all of that sort of thing. And like, even a game I didn't bet on, the Kentucky game, right? You're sitting there going like, man, I couldn't even get that game with Kentucky with an extra 5 minutes of overtime. And it's just play within your means, whatever those means are. Trust what you're doing because the worm will turn, and nothing crazy had to happen. I was sort of sitting there waiting, and I said to my friends, I was out with them on Friday, and they're like, man, you're pretty chipper for a guy who's like absolutely getting killed here. I'm like, it's just one of 1,000 bets, man. Like it's just one of like, honestly, more than 1,000 bets. But you are still joking about like, man, like at some point I said, I forget who it was. It might've been Miami and USC. I was like, do you think USC knows they have absolutely no chance of winning this game because they are wrapped up in my cold streak? Like they don't know. They're sitting there playing, they're trying their hardest, they're tying the game. And it's like, they don't know that they are in the vortex of the cold streak, those poor guys. Right. And so like, it's just a matter of variance. It's just a matter of being responsible. The worm will turn. You'll get on hot streaks. You'll get on cold streaks. Did we need the polar opposites back-to-back days? No, not necessarily, but I think it's a really good example for people from a responsible betting message type of thing going forward to understand this is how this works. Ideally, not that often. And instead of, maybe I'll trade a 11-0 for an 0-11 if I can trade a 1-15 for a 15-1. But I think anybody sort of following the podcast knows that over the long term here, we do pretty well. And I didn't have to venture that. I didn't have to sort of tell people that because, again, we talk about these plays, and a lot of places, they give out their plays and then they just let the house burn as they walk away. And they'll come back on the next week and they'll be like, small losing weekend, which again, that's what it was, 13-16-1, small losing tournament so far. But it's like, no, it's worth mentioning how we got there, because I think this isn't This isn't people going to make bets exactly the way that we make bets. It's impossible to do. You can't just tail someone every single time. It's about trust. So whether you win or lose a bet when you tail somebody, it's, okay, I trust that person put in the work. I trust that person understands how to bet from a responsible and from a handicapping standpoint. And then whatever happens, happens. And so I think that's important when it comes to sort of having a trust with the audience. And in the sports betting space, that just doesn't exist, right? Because everybody just makes their plays and then they walk away as the house burns down. I think it's important to say, hey man, the house got really, really hot in there for a while, but then the AC kicked back in. We got things going back again. So anyway, just wanted to sort of talk about that for a second here before we go.
All good, man. All good. And again, we got more coming up with March Madness coverage. Obviously, as the tournament kicks back in, Sweet 16 starts on Thursday, and we will be back before then with a preview of said matchups with our best bets and all of the other fun stuff. But until then, my dude, thank you for stopping by.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks to Matt for coming on the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder, if you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, it stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. Of course, we got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.